Radioactivity is everywhere in the water, in the air, in the ground, and coming down on us literally from the stars, or rather, our star, the sun. And it's not just Superman. Even you are a little radioactive, but there is a limit to what our bodies can handle. So today we are going to look at what happens when the human body is exposed to various levels of radiation through various historical events. Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we explore all things that are at least a little bit dark, from deadly diseases to natural disasters, from true crime to man-made catastrophes. So if that's your kind of thing, come along and let's get morbid. First, let's start with some background. Radioactive elements have been around since before the beginning of recorded time, long before humans even began to study the Earth and its components. Yet, the first person to realize the existence of radioactive elements didn't do so until 1896. It's a little funny to know that the year before William Röntgen accidentally invented the X-ray, which used electromagnetic radiation, he had no idea how it worked. A year later, a French physicist named Henri Becquerel changed the world when he discovered radioactivity. He had a fondness for an element that you definitely know by name, uranium. He made it his mission to find a link between X-rays and phosphorescence using uranium salts. And after some faulty conclusions, he stumbled upon the truth and learned that there are elements that are able to release radiation without any stimulation from outside sources. He discovered radioactivity. And while many in the scientific world continued to focus on X-rays, in 1898, a married couple of scientists decided that they would focus their research on this new field. If you haven't figured out who I'm talking about yet, I guess I'll just have to tell you. Do Marie and Pierre Curie ring a bell? They would go on to be inseparable from the field of radiology. They would discover other radioactive elements, polonium, thorium, and radium. They also figured out how to measure how strong the radioactivity of a sample was. Oh, and they actually coined the term radioactivity. In 1903, Becquerel and the Curies won the Nobel Prize for their work. Only 2 years later, Becquerel died suddenly of a reported heart attack. He was only 55. I saw a source that said that he kept uranium in his breast pocket, and he had burns on his skin at the time of his death. So did he actually die from exposure to the same element that made him famous? We'll never know. But what we do know is that his colleagues did die from their work. Officially, Pierre Curie died in an accident. He fell in the streets of Paris at the wrong moment. When he hit the ground, his head was immediately run over by a horse-drawn cart, and he died instantly. Sounds like an accident. But what if I told you that his ability to walk was greatly affected by bone deterioration caused by radiation exposure? If he hadn't died in that accident, he probably would have died very soon from the effects of the radiation. So, wouldn't you agree that his death was in fact related to radiation? Marie Curie would live a good deal longer than her husband, but she was just living on borrowed time. In 1934, her time was up. She died from a condition known to be caused by radiation exposure, aplastic anemia. It is a condition where the bone marrow is damaged and can no longer make any of the components of blood. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. It leaves you without enough oxygen circulating in the body, without a well-functioning immune system, and without the ability for blood to clot. a triple whammy. And the sad thing is, by the time that the Curies died, it was well known that exposure to radioactive elements was deadly. You have to look at a group of young women in the United States to see how radioactive materials, and especially radium, began to be seen as less of a marvel of modern science and more as something to be feared. Now, here is where I give my shameless plug. Times are getting harder and harder, and I am trying to build this channel to hopefully get monetized because just like a lot of other families, mine is also struggling. So, I want to make you a promise. If you subscribe and watch videos and make comments, when I get monetized, I promise to donate 10% of everything I ever make from this channel. But that's not it. I will choose a couple charities each month that you guys suggest. And then you, my subscribers, will vote each month on which charity will receive that month's donation. And I will come with receipts. You will be privy to how much money is actually being sent. So please help me out. Let's make this channel a light in such a dark world. Thanks. All right, let's get back to it. So now let's go back to World War One, the war to end all wars. Go figure. Anyway, soldiers were living in the trenches night and day, and to keep themselves hidden and still be able to tell the time, a fancy new addition was added to their watches: radium. So the whole thing about radioactive materials glowing is true. Well, sort of. Only some do, but the cool thing is that depending on the element, a different color is emitted. But iconic radioactive green, that is radium. So, a bunch of factories took on a job of making watches glow by having the numbers hand painted using paint containing radium. They hired hundreds of women, some just teenagers. Women were specifically hired because their hands were smaller and they could be more detailed and exact. At the time, radium was considered to be a miracle element. It was thought to have had great health benefits and could give a person more energy. While working in these factories, women were exposed to shocking amounts of radium, and it got everywhere. It would get on their clothes, in their hair, and horrifically in their mouths. Well, how do we know that? Well, they would use their lips to make the tips of the paintbrushes fine for the tiny numbers on the watch faces. They had no idea how dangerous it was. Even some use radium to paint their teeth for a literally radiant smile. Glow in the dark was the new fad, and it was raging. But as you can imagine, it wasn't long before women started to realize that something was wrong. One of the first was Amelia Maggia of Orange, New Jersey. Her first symptom was a mere toothache. It wasn't long before her mouth began to bleed constantly, and it was filled with painful ulcers. Eventually, her pain spread to her jaw, and it literally began to fall apart. So, she ended up having to have her jaw removed. You can imagine how traumatic that must have been, especially that day and age when people with physical difference weren't at all accepted by society. And unfortunately, the operation didn't stop the progression of her illness. She had no idea what was happening to her, nor did she know why. And she died at only 24 years old. And she was only the first. As more and more watch painters began to experience strange symptoms and extreme pain, the public began to be aware that maybe radium wasn't as safe as they thought. Yet the companies that employed these women denied that radium was responsible. Lawsuits against the companies failed, and women continued to sicken and die until 1938, when one of the women finally won a lawsuit. These women suffered from deteriorating bone, cancer, and so many other ills. And it's terrible to know that most of those women never got any justice. But something good did come of it. The plight of the Radium Girls, as they are now known, eventually led to the creation of an institution that we hate, but we should really appreciate more: OSHA. Although they can be a pain in the ass, OSHA protects the worker from dangerous situations that greedy companies might otherwise subject their employees to. Now we move to World War II, or its end. You can't talk about death by radiation without talking about Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The United States used two atom bombs against Japan, which pushed them to surrender, ending the war. On August 6th, 1945, Little Boy, a uranium bomb, was dropped over Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man, a plutonium bomb, was dropped over Nagasaki. What a lot of people don't know is that it actually wasn't supposed to be Nagasaki. Due to the weather and a last minute change, a city called Kokura was spared. Now, the type of bomb that Little Boy was had never been tested before it was dropped, and it was learned that the bomb hadn't been as efficient as had been expected. Just over 1% of the uranium actually fissioned. Yet, it killed over an estimated 66,000 people instantly, with 40,000 more dying over the coming months. It's believed that another 100,000 died within the next 5 years from cancer and other conditions caused by the radiation exposure. Those who died initially were killed by the immense heat that reached 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Do you understand how hot that is? For comparison, steel melts at 2,800 degrees. People were literally incinerated, leaving behind shadows etched into the pavement, stone steps, and buildings. Their cities and their people were there, and literally in an instant, with no hyperbole, they were just gone. But when I think of the victims of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, I can't help but think of two people in particular: Sadako Sasaki and Tsutomu Yamaguchi. When I was a kid, I learned about a little girl who wasn't much older than I was at the time. Her name was Sadako, and she was from Hiroshima, Japan. And that's where she was when the bomb fell. At the time, she'd only been 2 years old, and she was living about a mile from the bomb's epicenter. She and her mother and brother all survived the blast, but not long after the blast, a strange black rain began to fall over the city and its survivors. What wasn't known at the time was that the rain was highly radioactive. This rain came back to haunt the family later on. Life in Hiroshima was hard for those who survived. Imagine living in a city with no food left, no infrastructure, and on top of that, people had developed all sorts of illnesses. And the little girl Sadako was no different. Probably as a result of her exposure to the black rain, she ended up developing leukemia. And during the 1940s, that was pretty much a death sentence. There were no real successful treatments at that time. But she heard a story that if you make 1,000 origami cranes, then you get a wish answered. She succeeded in making well over 1,000 before her death, but there was no miraculous recovery, and she died at the age of 12. But that little girl went on to become a symbol for peace. Her story is a heartbreaking tale of how, when you use indiscriminate weapons, their victims can be anyone, even an innocent child who had no part in any war. There is now a statue in Hiroshima, Japan, of Sadako and a paper crane. The other person is Tsutomu Yamaguchi, and holy crap, he has to simultaneously be the luckiest and the unluckiest person to have ever lived. In August 1945, Yamaguchi was temporarily living in Hiroshima while he was working for the Mitsubishi Company. It was August 6th, his last day in Hiroshima, before he was supposed to go back home to his wife and baby in his hometown. He was literally getting ready to leave the city when he saw something that would change the world. You already know now that that was the first atomic bomb. As soon as he saw the flash, Yamaguchi, who had had some training, did what he had been trained to do. He threw himself to the ground and got into a ditch. He used his hands to try to protect his eyes from the flash and his ears from the deafening sound that followed, but it didn't help much. As the wave passed over his body, it was picked up and flung. His eardrums burst and he lost consciousness. When he came to, he couldn't hear anything, couldn't see anything. That wasn't all. Aside from the damage from the shockwave, he suffered from radiation burns. Amazingly, he made the trip home the next day. He took the following day off, then on August 9th, actually went back to work at his regular office in Nagasaki. He was literally in the process of explaining what he had gone through to his boss when the second bomb was dropped over Nagasaki. The terrain in Nagasaki reduced the damage, not that it was enough for most residents of the city. Luckily for Yamaguchi and his colleagues, the area of the building that they were in was reinforced and it protected them from the worst of the blast. Although he did suffer further injuries. By some miracle, he went on to live a very long life, and he died at 93 years old. And he actually spent the last decade of his life being a vocal opponent for the use of nuclear weapons. It's time for the trivia question of the day. The first person to comment the correct answer down below will get a shout out in next week's video. Here we go. What is the name of the phase of radiation sickness where a person seems to be healthy, but their DNA has been decimated and their death is nigh? In this modern day, we don't fear nuclear attack as much as we once did. Sure, we still get the heebie-jeebies when someone mentions the possibility of attacking nuclear reactors, whether as an act of terrorism or war. But the true reality is the nuclear energy industry is the one that actually poses the risk. Full disclosure, I am not really a fan of nuclear energy. From the risks of natural disaster to human error to what to do with the nuclear waste to the thousands of years that it takes for radioactive materials to fully degrade, it's the accidents that really make you reconsider nuclear energy. Now, there are a few incidents that can come to mind when you think of nuclear energy gone wrong. 3 Mile Island or Fukushima, but there is one that stands out above all others. The one and only Chernobyl. You know it well. And by some miracle you don't, well, here's an introductory course. Chernobyl was the name of a nuclear power plant built by the Soviets 2 miles outside of a Ukrainian town called Pripyat. It had been built in the 1970s and had only been operational for a few years, and it was the pride of the Soviet nuclear power industry. The plant consisted of 4 nuclear reactors, with the culprit, number 4, being only 3 years old. Now, I didn't know before this video, doing my research, that there are different types of reactors. They differ in the configuration of the reactors, what types of elements are used for the fuel, the ways that they produce steam, the coolants and moderators that they use, among other factors that are way above my pay grade. But Chernobyl was a RBMK type reactor, which is a lot of Russian, and I am not about to embarrass myself like that. But What I can do is tell you basically how this type of reactor worked. The uranium fuel rods, placed very precisely, release energy through radiation, which heats the water around them. The water is turned into steam, which then causes the turbines to turn, creating electricity. Now, here's where it gets sketchy. Some of the energy created by the reactors is cycled back into the system to power the pumps that push cooler water into the reactor, making sure that it doesn't get too hot. Do you see the problem here? The reactor is relying on its own production of electricity to keep itself running safely. I would say, can you imagine what would happen if something went wrong? But you don't have to imagine, because that's exactly what happened. On April 26th, 1986, just after midnight, shit hit the fan. The staff at the power plant was ordered to conduct a safety test of the backup generators. But to do that, they had to power down the reactor. About 20 minutes after the beginning of the test, the power in the reactor dropped drastically, too fast, and the power levels would have to be raised again. Not seeing it as an omen, the staff continued with the test. Soon after, one worker turned on the auxiliary pumps, not realizing that too much water was being pushed into the reactor way too fast. And terrifyingly, nobody had a clue. Why is that a big deal, you wonder? Well, cold water pumped into the reactor so fast that it lowered the water temperature, which meant the water was no longer getting hot enough to turn into steam. Remember, no steam, no electricity, which means the pumps shut down, which means the reactor gets hot, real hot. They had no idea that when they began the active phase of the safety drill, the reactor was already far too hot. Alarms all over the control room began blaring. Staff immediately tried to do an emergency shutdown of the reactor, which should have ended the situation by dropping the control rods into the reactor, stopping nuclear radiation from creating more heat. The problem was that when that happened, the control rods, which were made from graphite, didn't shut down the process. Instead, it caused a power surge, and that literally made the reactor explode. Over the next couple hours, the plant's firefighting unit fought against the massive fire. They literally had no idea that they were in the heart of a nuclear meltdown. Between plant workers caught in the blast and firefighters, 31 were killed in the first hours of the crisis. 2 of those were from the initial explosion. Officially, to this day, only 50 deaths have been directly caused by the meltdown, but that's nowhere near the true number. From the beginning, the Soviet government didn't want anyone to know that there had been a significant nuclear incident. They didn't want the public to know. The incident could undermine the authority of the government, causing the people to believe that the government was inept. The government didn't want the wider world to find out, because that would mean international embarrassment. The initial victims, aside from the 2 who died, all died from acute radiation syndrome. These people were all exposed to a more severe type of radiation called gamma radiation. It was able to penetrate right through the body, destroying DNA within the cells of the body. With the DNA being wiped out, the cells could no longer replicate and renew cells in the body. Their bodies were dead at the cellular level, even though they were still breathing. Gamma radiation can cause a few different types of syndromes that fall under the umbrella of acute radiation syndrome. Bone marrow syndrome is where the bone marrow is destroyed, leads to the issues with immune and circulatory systems. People with bone marrow syndrome often die from infections or hemorrhaging. The mortality rate of this syndrome is greatly dependent on the level of radiation exposure. The higher the exposure, the lower chance of survival. Gastrointestinal syndrome is pretty much fatal in all cases, with very few ever surviving. The gastrointestinal tract is devastated. This leaves the body unable to prevent infection and affects the body's ability to maintain itself, which leads to dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. People with gastrointestinal syndrome usually succumb within 2 weeks. Then you have the cardiovascular central nervous system syndrome. This usually kills a person within 3 days. With this syndrome, the body's circulatory system is ruined by a condition called vasculitis. It's the inflammation of blood vessels, which means narrower channels, which means reduced blood flow, which ultimately causes organ damage. The brain is notably affected. Death for these people often comes from the swelling of the brain and lack of blood flow to the brain and infection of the brain. It's all bad news. But pretty much no matter which of these syndromes a person gets, the first symptoms that they all seem to experience are the same: nausea and vomiting. Those who were up close and personal with Chernobyl during the disaster suffered these horrible fates. But they weren't the only ones. As I said before, the Soviet government didn't initially inform those living around the nuclear plant that anything had happened. It wasn't until the next day that people were told to quickly pack a bag and grab any important documents that they might have. These people had no idea that this evacuation was going to be permanent, and they really had no idea that by this time they had all been exposed to notable levels of radiation. Beyond the plant, large amounts of radioactive iodine had been released, and it was deadly. Although I couldn't find an actual death toll for Chernobyl beyond those who were at the plant, in 2005, the United Nations released a document that estimates that 4,000 people, mostly children and teens, had or would eventually die from exposure to radiation from Chernobyl. The leading cause of these radiation deaths would actually be caused by thyroid cancer. The land around Chernobyl, called the exclusion zone, is still dangerous, and cleanup is projected to continue for the next 40 years. The land itself will not be safe for human habitation for thousands of years to come. So, with what you have learned in this video today, what is your take on nuclear energy? Do you think that the benefit over fossil fuels is worth the risk? Or do you think that that risk is far too great? Comment below. Nuclear power, yay or nay? And that's it for today's video. If you liked it and want to see more, subscribe, hit the like button. It all helps my channel grow. Check out one of my several playlists for more videos, and particularly if you want a good video, I recommend Toxic Towns. And as always, don't forget to be merry, but stay morbid.